Hey everyone, it's the Ioniq guy, and behind me today you see my Hyundai Ioniq 5, and this is the 2023 Kia EV6 GT. And today's a video I've been wanting to make for a very long time, and that is comparing the Kia EV6 with the Hyundai Ioniq 5. For the purposes of today's video, we're going to pretend that this isn't a GT trim, that this is just the normal EV6 dual motor, same powertrain as my Hyundai Ioniq 5. I want to compare the two as if somebody were cross-shopping an Ioniq 5 SEL with a EV6 wind trim. So that's what we're going to do today. So if you're trying to decide between these two cars, stay tuned. So a little backstory. This is my 2022 Hyundai Ioniq 5 SEL all-wheel drive, seen here in digital teal. I have had this car for about a year and 3 months, and I've lived with it every single day. I commute to work with it. Now, when I bought my Hyundai Ioniq 5 in January of 2022, the Kia EV6 wasn't yet on sale here in the United States. So I didn't really have the choice to get an EV6 unless I wanted to wait. So maybe you guys remember back in January of 2022, interest rates were still super low. Trade-in values on used cars were through the roof. I sold my Mazda CX-5 for basically what I paid for it 2 years prior. So before used car values crashed and interest rates went up, I really wanted to get out of that CX-5 and into an EV. And this is what I ended up with. And now I'm the Ioniq guy. And this Kia EV6 GT is on loan from Kia, so thank you Kia for providing this review unit. So this car is pretty new to the market. This particular press vehicle only has 2,800 miles on it. I've been driving it for nearly a week now. It's a ton of fun, but it's not for me. So as fun as the Kia EV6 GT is to drive, I personally would never buy this trim. The seats are just not built for my body size and shape. So for that reason alone, I would completely not consider this car. I can see the GT being a fun weekend car for somebody with a lot of money, but for most people, I think this is going to be a real stretch to say that you would want to live with it on a daily basis. That is unless you're charging at home every single day, because the range is less than 200 miles in my testing. So when looking at these two cousins, there's a lot about these cars that are very similar. The powertrain is identical. The powertrain was developed by Hyundai and it's shared between Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis. So the car's power, the car's charging ability, the battery pack size, that's all common between Hyundai and Kia. So we can kind of check that off the list as being the biggest overarching similarity between these two vehicles. These two cars have basically the exact same specs, 321 horsepower, 446 pound-feet of torque. Remember, we're pretending this isn't the GT with almost 600 horsepower. 77.4 kilowatt-hour battery pack, charges 10 to 80% in just 18 minutes in ideal conditions. So the Hyundai Ioniq 5 has a 118-inch wheelbase. The EV6 has a 114-inch wheelbase, but the EV6 is a few inches longer than the Ioniq 5. So the EV6 is technically the bigger of the two cars in terms of length. Now in terms of height, the EV6 is just over 2 inches shorter than the Ioniq 5. So if headroom is what you're all about, you're gonna wanna go with the Ioniq 5, and I'll show you more about that after. Both of these vehicles have the same measly little front trunk, but you can see in mine that you're able to store your emergency kit, your tire inflation kit, the V2L adapter, a Tesla tap, a few critical things that you don't want to have to dig through in your trunk if you've got a bunch of other stuff in there. One interesting difference between the Ioniq 5 and the EV6 though, is the Ioniq 5 has a low conductivity coolant, which needs to be changed after about 30,000 miles. The Kia EV6 doesn't have it. So you have less maintenance to do with an EV6 versus an Ioniq 5. And it's kind of strange because they share so many of the same powertrain components. Why does one car have a certain fluid and the other car doesn't? I'm still kind of stumped on that front. Both cars are available with power folding exterior mirrors. Both of these cars have the ability to present their door handles upon approach. Something the EV6 has that the Ioniq 5 doesn't have is an opening sunroof. My Ioniq 5 doesn't have the panoramic fixed glass roof, but that is available on the limited trim. Both cars have electrically actuated charging cover flaps. In terms of cargo capacity, the Ioniq 5 has the EV6 beat by about 3 cubic feet with the seats up and 10 cubic feet with the seats folded down. And a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that this has a much more severely sloped rear cargo area, whereas the Ioniq 5 is a little bit more vertical. One place where the Ioniq 5 really shines in terms of cargo capacity is the fact that the rear seats slide forward and backward. That cannot be said for the EV6. And when you do that, you get this decently sized gap between the back of the seats and the trunk area, and it's actually a pretty useful space. I did use that space once or twice when loading this car up fully. In terms of trunk openings, the EV6 is about 39 inches, and the Ioniq 5 is 41 inches. So you've got a bigger trunk opening on the Ioniq 5, which is nice. And wow, towards the center upper section here, the Ioniq 5's trunk opening is 47 inches wide. Here on the EV6, it's consistently 37 inches wide the entire way up. So this trunk opening is much smaller than the Ioniq 5. So if you want to fit big stuff in your car, the Ioniq 5 is the only option. In terms of depth, you have 38 inches here in the Ioniq 5, and here in the EV6, you've got just about 38 inches as well. So depth-wise, they're about the same, but when you do slide those rear seats forward, this gets a lot more depth. In terms of underfloor storage, the Ioniq 5 also has the EV6 beat by just a smidge, but here in the EV6 on the top trim, the subwoofer is located under this panel here, whereas in the Ioniq 5 Limited trim, the subwoofer takes up almost this entire space of underfloor storage. So in actuality, in a higher trim level, the EV6 does have more underfloor storage versus the Ioniq 5. So something to keep in mind. Both cars have LED license plate lights. Both cargo areas have 4 D-rings in all 4 corners for strapping down loads. Something the EV6 has that the Ioniq 5 does not is release levers to fold down the rear seats. And I cannot tell you how nice of a feature that is to have. And it's very frustrating when you have to go around to each side of the car to release the back seats with the lever on the side. And both cars are available with automatic tailgate. Now, because the Ioniq 5 has a longer wheelbase than the EV6, the back seat door is much longer than the Kia EV6's. On the Ioniq 5, the door is about 47 inches. And on the EV6, it's about 42 inches. The reason I bring this up is just because this door is very large, and you can feel it when you open it in tight spots. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to get out of this back seat. Now, with the driver's seat adjusted for me at 6'2", here's how much knee room I have left. It's a couple inches. It's not a ton, but it's good enough. Thigh support is fairly decent. The seats are a little bit higher in the Ioniq 5 than in the EV6. So taller drivers will find that the back seat is more comfortable here. So it works out that I have about 3 inches of headroom in the Ioniq 5. So here in the back of the EV6, you can see I actually have a little bit more knee room with the driver's seat adjusted for me. Headroom is definitely a little lacking. I can't even get a full fist. So headroom overall is maybe about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So it's a few inches shorter than the Ioniq 5, and it shows. And the recurring theme of openness that the Ioniq 5 is known for is not present here in the back seat of the EV6. This window is very narrow. It feels like you're in a tank. Under the front seats, there is 0 room to tuck your feet up if you want to stretch your legs out. So when there's already hardly any thigh support and you can't move your feet forward very much, you're going to have a very uncomfortable ride after a while. So when I do lift the front driver's seat up, I do gain a lot more foot space, but this is the GT trim. It's all manual seats, so I can't really comment on whether this is the same in the GT line or the Wind trim. So if you want really cool paint color options, the EV6 is the car to go with. This comes in this runway red, there's yacht blue, there's some really cool colors. Whereas with the Ioniq 5, Hyundai went with a much more muted palette. And in my opinion, the digital teal is probably the coolest of the colors. Sometimes it looks gray, sometimes it looks green, sometimes it looks blue. It's kind of a chameleon in that sense. So unless you feel like wrapping your brand new Ioniq 5, the EV6 is definitely cooler on the color front. As with the exterior, the interior of the Kia EV6 is much sportier. It's much more driver focused. It's definitely much more enclosed feeling. This center console is much larger than the Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 5 center console is very open, and you can even move it forward and backward in the limited trim. But here, this is fixed in place, and it's honestly kind of big and intrusive. There's some storage space below, but it's rather hard to access because you have to stick your arm here and then you have to kind of reach in, which isn't very comfortable to do. The Qi wireless charging pad is up here in the open, and I have had no issues with my phone overheating this past week while charging, whereas in the Ioniq 5, I've had consistent issues with overheating of phones. And I think that's because it's under an overhang, so the heat doesn't really have anywhere to dissipate to. So I do like that the phone charging pad is very out here in the open, allows for plenty of fresh air to get in and cool the phone off. It's also easier just to place your phone right here when you get in the car. Now, something I love, love, love about the Kia EV6, hard buttons for seat heaters, steering wheel heater, and if this car were equipped, ventilated seats. I love that they're so easily accessible, but there is one caveat, and it has to do with this dual purpose radio control and HVAC control. I find myself wanting to rest my hand here while I'm fiddling with this touchscreen down here, and I have found myself on multiple occasions accidentally turning on my steering wheel heater or my heated seats. And I might use my thumb to brace the rest of my hand. I might use my pinky to brace the rest of my hand. And I just keep inadvertently hitting these buttons. So I will give Kia a lot of credit. I love having the buttons. I just kind of wish they were placed somewhere lower here that wasn't directly at the front edge of this where you actually want to rest your hand to be able to use this lower touchscreen. And about that lower touchscreen, when you press this button here in the center, it switches to HVAC controls. The volume and the tune knob turn into temperature dials, and after a few seconds it reverts back to the radio controls. It's about 5 to 10 seconds, and there's some fixed HVAC controls on the left side here that are always there. You have front defrost, rear defrost, auto climate, the 3 different levels, as well as recirculation. So I do like that there's a few hard buttons here, and most of the time I'm using auto climate in the car, so it's not that big of a deal that I have to swap to the HVAC screen. But it is kind of fiddly, but I found out a trick. If you hold down on the button that you press to switch between the screens, it gives you the option to return to either climate or infotainment after switching with that button. So if you prefer to have your climate controls there all the time, you can set it for climate and it will always revert after 5 seconds or so back to climate. Or if you would prefer to have the infotainment buttons there, you can do the same thing. So I do like that Kia gives you the choice there. That is a nice touch. Getting used to the rotary shifter has been fairly easy. I like the placement of the shifter. Actually, it's really easy to get in the car and your hand just falls to the power button and the shifter. Whereas on the Ioniq 5, you have to reach up to the front, hit the button, and then shift. These cup holders are on the smaller side, so decently sized bottles will not fit. I do kind of miss having an enclosed armrest. This way you can keep things out of sight, out of mind. And interestingly enough, the EV6 does not have a latch. It just uses the friction of the hinge to keep itself closed, which is kind of cool. Just like with the Ioniq 5, you have an absolutely massive glove box. I'm never going to have enough stuff in my car to actually fill up the glove box. And it is a very far reach to even get into the glove box, so it's not all that useful for me. I really wish Hyundai would have given us the drawer that is seen in other markets instead of the traditional glove box where it's just a big square opening. Now, in terms of technology, I'm not going to really go over much because these cars are more or less identical. They offer all the same safety features, they have the exact same screens, they have the same software, same navigation system. There's pretty much zero difference on that front, so I'm not going to get into that. What I am going to get into though is the sound system, and I have a separate video where I talk about the sound system, but just a view from 30,000 feet. If you care about audio, the EV6 with its 14 speaker Meridian sound system is so much better than the 6 speaker in the Ioniq 5 or even the 8 speaker in the Ioniq 5. The top level limited trims sound system really isn't that much better than the 6 speaker. You gain a center channel and you gain a sub, and that's it. Here you have 3 speakers in the front, 4 speakers in both sets of doors, 2 speakers in the back, as well as a subwoofer, and it just sounds much better. So if audio is important to you, test drive the Kia EV6 and take a listen to what their sound system sounds like. Something I really dislike about this cabin is all the gloss black trim. I really hate this. I hope this trend dies very soon. I think we're kind of starting to see it kind of get phased out. It's one of those design details. I don't know why it ever picked up steam because it just looks so gross most of the time. Most of the time it's covered in fingerprints, oils, dust. It just doesn't look good. Granted, when it's nicely polished up and cleaned, it looks really good. But I'm gonna say 90% of the time, it looks like crap. And I know they were going for the sport look, and they achieved that, but you pay that price when you get that gloss black trim. But thank you, Kia, for including USB-C ports in your car. Apparently you live in the year 2023, so thank you. Up front, you have two USB-Cs, a USB-A, which is used for Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and in the back seat, you have those two USB-C ports. So plenty of USB-C throughout this car. Both cars have auto down, as well as auto up front windows. Both cars have all the same drive modes, so you have iPedal level 1 through 3. You also have auto regen, so all the same niceties that you get with the eGMP platform cars are between both cars. Both cars are available with automatic wipers. Both cars are also available with the rear seat 110 volt outlet that outputs up to 1800 watts. And that's about it. Both cars are very similarly equipped. The main differences are just going to be in touch and feel and look. Do you want a really sporty looking interior? Because this is the car to get. Everything's angled towards the driver. It's all within arm's reach, so you don't have to take your hands very far from the steering wheel. And in the Ioniq 5, you have a very big, open, airy, almost living room-like interior, and it really feels like it. Here in the Ioniq 5, look at all this space. Look at all this open space down here. It's so breathable, it's so airy. I love spending time in the cabin of the Ioniq 5. It just gives me a breath of fresh air. I just love leaning back here. If you're a very tall person, you're gonna really appreciate all this extra knee room over here. I'm 6'2" and my knee intrudes just a little bit, but if I were 6'5", 6'6", you would really have some good space to put your knee, which is really nice. You have these really big surfaces for your arms, which the EV6 just doesn't have. There's a lot more elbow room on the driver door versus the EV6. And I just really like the feeling of this armrest. It's just nice and big. In the EV6, your cup holders are right here. It's just kind of poor placement in my opinion, especially if you have a passenger in the car. It completely blocks their arm from being able to take up this whole space. Here in the Ioniq 5, both passengers can have their arms on the armrests, and then their cup is right at hand's reach. You can see I've got a ton of headspace in here. Just like with the EV6, you've got LED lighting up top. You've got HomeLink on your mirror, BlueLink and SOS buttons. Your wireless Qi charging pad is down here in the center console. There's also two USB-As, a third USB-A, and a 12 volt outlet up front. You've got a very similarly sized glove box. And this storage space is just much more accessible versus the EV6. I just feel like my legs have much more space. I feel much more comfortable in this car. The steering wheel feels really nice. It's a good size. It's slightly flat bottomed. Something that has taken some getting used to with the EV6 is the steering wheel controls are completely switched versus the Ioniq 5. So I've had a bit of a hard time with the muscle memory trying to get used to driving the EV6 for the last week. Now, something the Ioniq 5 also has that the EV6 doesn't is the relaxation seat. I do not have that in my SEL, but it is available on the limited trim. I'll put in some footage here. But all it does is it reclines the seat back, tilts it up, puts out the calf rest, and you can just sit back and lay back while you're stopped to charge. So the choice is yours. You just really have to pick. Do you want sporty or do you really want open and airy? So that about does it here in the Ioniq 5. So now's the big question. After living with the EV6 for a week, do I think I made the right decision going with the Ioniq 5? And the answer is yes. I absolutely love the Ioniq 5, more so than the EV6. The EV6 does have some niceties that the Ioniq 5 doesn't, but I don't think I would give up the things about the Ioniq 5 that I really like to get an EV6. I really like the 14-speaker sound system. It sounds amazing. I'd love for about the same price in the EV6, I can get ventilated seats. I also like that you get rain-sensing wipers for the same price as an Ioniq 5 SEL. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to for me is storage space and sheer comfort. For me, the Ioniq 5 is a much more comfortable ride. In terms of head space, knee space, leg space, the Ioniq 5 has the EV6 beat. I like that it has a little bit more of a softer suspension. I don't take my Ioniq 5 to the track. A lot of EV6 GT owners are probably going to do that, but I don't race this car. I'm not going to race this car, so the softer suspension is fine in my book. I prefer comfort. Whereas the EV6 GT is about as extreme as you can get in terms of a suspension. It has active dampers though, so it is adjustable, but I've even heard from most people that the EV6 does have a firmer suspension versus the Ioniq 5. So just in terms of suspension comfort, the Ioniq 5 is more up my alley. And then just pure looks. I just think the Ioniq 5 looks better. Don't get me wrong, I think the EV6 is a nice looking car. I think it looks better from certain angles. It's definitely sleeker looking, it's definitely sportier looking. But I think at the end of the day, I just really prefer the kind of retro classic look of the Ioniq 5. I love the pixel theme. I love all the square little pixels all over the car. It just has that Retrotron kind of futuristic look. Versus the EV6 is almost more traditional type of sports car looking stuff with the big side haunches around the rear wheels, the blacked out A-pillars to give it that floating roofline look, the flying buttresses on the side. It's just a much more aggressive, sporty looking car, and I personally just don't really want that. I like the more upright stance of the Ioniq 5. I like the hard lines of it. I like the boxiness of it versus the EV6. It's certainly not a boxy car, but compared to the EV6, it's much boxier. But regardless of which one you pick, you still get the same technology that enables you to charge from 10 to 80% in just 18 minutes in ideal conditions. And at the end of the day, that was the biggest selling point for the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And if I had the chance, the Kia EV6. I want to be able to DC fast charge really quickly. That's important to me. That really makes the transition to an EV so much easier for somebody coming from gas. People coming from gas don't want to charge for 40 minutes. There's still new EVs coming out that charge in 40 minutes. The 2024 Kona Electric is more or less the same as the outgoing. It charges 10 to 80% in 40 minutes. And for a commuter car, that's fine, but if you want to do any road tripping, that's going to seriously add some time. So anyway, guys, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Are you for EV6 or are you for Ioniq 5? And if you're on the fence, what are the points that are really making you question which one you'd prefer? So for those of you who are interested in the Ioniq 5, why don't you check out this video right here. I did a deep dive into the limited trim this January. So if you want to know more about the limited, check that video out. But if you like today's video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care, everybody.